In this video, we're going to take a look at Noodler's Akhmatova. Let's jump straight to the end with my opinion on this ink. A permanent green that isn't aggressive, mostly. Slight tone variation by Nib, but nothing as far as shading goes. I generally, other than art, don't have much use for such a permanent ink. And I think sometimes permanence comes with a price. Like getting deep into the page, ruining the back of the page so that you can't write back there. I see nothing wrong or bad about this ink, but for me, I would pass on a bottle just because I have virtually no need for this level of resistance in a green ink, but for no other reason. If resistance was something that really mattered to me, I see this as a very good option. I like to change things up by using a different pen each day. Today that pen is a Fountain Pen Revolution Japer with the Fountain Pen Revolution Broad Nib. It's inked up, used for a day, and used to take the notes for this video. To see how I arrived at that opinion, let's take a look at the first writing sample done on Clairfontaine. Looking at the fine nib, we get a nice lighter green, and not so light at all that it's any kind of an issue. It's just lighter for some of the greens that I've seen. It's not feathering, it's not spreading, it's not shading. It is very bonded with the page, and I think it does it fairly quickly because it's hard to smear, making it good for lefties. Looking at the medium nib, we get just a tad bit darker than we had with the fine. We get no feather, we get no spread, we get no shading, we just get a solid performing but very there green. Looking at the double broad, it is a little bit darker than we had with the medium. It doesn't feather, doesn't spread, doesn't shade. I actually think for the tones we're going to see of this ink, this is almost at exactly what I would actually prefer this ink to look like. I think the tone here is very nice. Looking at the back of the page, we see that the ink was rather aggressive into the page, meaning you can't write back here because there's a lot of ghosting and heavy into the paper, but nothing bled through and touched the page underneath. To have a range of experience with this ink, all of the writing samples are done with a Pelikan M120 Idyllic Blue with a fine nib, a Pelikan P200 with a medium nib, a Pelikan M205 the Duo Highlighter with a double broad nib. The next writing sample is done on a WritePad's reporter pad. Looking at the fine nib, we get a tad bit lighter than we had on the Clairfontaine. We have no feather, we have no spread, we have no shading. I'm going to take back the feather remark because on the bottom swoop of the top line T, I see a tiny little bit. It's that little that, you know, your eye just misses it initially until you're really looking. Looking at the medium nib, it is a tad bit darker than we had with the fine, a tad bit lighter than we had on the Clairfontaine. We do get some feathering fairly regularly on all of this, although I don't see the feathering as an issue to stop someone from using it. We do see a tiny bit of spread, not something that should stop anybody from using this, and we don't get any kind of shading at all. We get permanence. Looking at the double broad, it is just a smidgen darker than it was with the medium, just a smidgen lighter than it was on the Clairfontaine. It does feather regularly and all over, but not out of control considering how wet this pen is and that the paper's not made for fountain pens. Tiny bit of spread, hard to notice with a double broad, but a tiny bit, and no shading at all. Looking at the back of the page, you see that we get no bleeding, no ghosting, no problem writing back here. I agree with Vita. There's a lot to learn by doing multiple chromatographies. The next writing sample is done in a FieldNotes reporter's notebook. Looking at the fine, we get a slightly brighter green, not lighter, brighter in how it's coming through on the paper, possibly from the tone of the paper really brightening this green up as compared to the Clairfontaine. We get no feathers, no spread, no shading, but a nicer green. Looking at the medium, it is a little bit darker than we had with the fine. It is a little bit brighter than we had on the Clairfontaine. Stuck on that word. No reason. Like, I haven't said Clairfontaine enough through the life of this channel. We don't get any kind of spread, but we do get little bits of feathering. On the third line, the word truth, you're really going to see it. Theorem, you're really going to see it. We don't get any shading. Not a surprise. Looking at the double broad, we get really the same tone that we had on the Clairfontaine, and it is a little bit darker than we had with the medium or the fine. It does feather a bit. It does spread, actually, much less than I would have expected. It does not shade, which we really weren't expecting here. I think we're getting a nice tone, just not nice writing from me with that pen. Looking at the back of the page, you see that the double broad got very deep into the paper, but the fine and medium, not so bad. With those, you could easily write on the back of the page. Nothing bled through to the page underneath.
Resistance tests are done to see how this ink can be expected to perform on the page, and more importantly, how hard it may be to clean from your pen. This smear is allowed to dry for 3 days before testing it.
And here we see the results of the resistance test.
The next writing sample is done in a Portage reporter's notebook.
Looking at the fine nib, we get a little bit lighter green than we had on the Clairfontaine. We get no feather, we get no spread, we get no shading. I'm really hoping this paper tends to be good. I'm hoping we don't bleed. I know we're not going to be able to see the back of the page because it's a permanent ink and they tend to be a little more aggressive into the paper. Looking at the medium nib, we get just a tad bit darker than we had with the fine. We get a little bit of feathering. Look at the OTH of others on the top line, and you see just a little bit there. On the third line, you're going to see that same tiny bit of feathering occurring on the word theorem. It's not spreading and it's not shading, but it is giving us that little bit of feathering, which isn't very common with this paper. Looking at the double broad, it is quite a bit darker than we had with the medium or the fine. It is also the same tone that we had on the Clairfontaine. It does feather fairly regularly and all over the place. It does spread just a little bit, and it does not shade, just giving us a very dark, ill-performing ink on this paper. Looking at the back of the page, you see that how deep the ink got in causes an extreme amount of ghosting. You can't write on the back of the page, but none of it came through and touched the page underneath.
With over 1,000 inks reviewed, let's take a look at some color comparables.
Here is KWZ Iron Gall Green number 4. Here is Noodler's Green Marine. Here is Papier Plume IV Green. Here is Robert Oster Jade.
The next writing sample is done in an Office Depot reporter's notebook.
Looking at the fine nib, it is very close to the tone that we had on the Clairfontaine. Very, very close, almost the same. It does feather just a little bit. It does spread just a little bit. It does not shade. I expect that it also does bleed because this paper bleeds everything. Looking at the medium nib, it is a little bit darker than we had with the fine. A little bit darker than it was on the Clairfontaine. It does feather, does spread, does not shade. It's just there, actually. It's not bad. I just don't like the paper. Looking at the double broad where we have absolutely set this paper up for failure, not like it needs the help. It is darker than it was with the fine or the medium. It is a little bit darker than it was on the Clairfontaine. It does feather constantly. It does spread constantly. It does not shade ever. Looking at the page underneath, with the amount of pencil that I've used circling, I think I Steinbecked that pencil. It bled a lot. Looking at the back of the page, you completely understand why, with the extreme amount of ghosting that this is doing, there's no writing back there.
While it's nice to compare it to other inks in the same color family, I'd prefer to find an ink that complements its color on the page.
Here is an orange ink by Elixir, their Siloso Sunset. Here is a purple ink by Krishna, their Moonview. Here is a black ink by Pilot, their Mixable Black. Here is a red ink by Noodlers, their Radler Red Eel, a lubricated ink.
The last writing sample is done on 20-pound copy paper.
Looking at the fine nib, it is a little bit, just a tad bit darker than it was on the Clairfontaine. It is feathering just a little bit. It is spreading just a little bit. It is not shading. It is forever bonded with this paper, with how permanent it is. Looking at the medium nib, about the same tone that we had with the fine, which puts it right about the same as the Clairfontaine. It does feather. It does spread. It does not shade. This is 20-pound copy paper, so we should not have high expectations for performance. Looking at the double broad, it is a bit darker than we had with both the fine and the medium here. It is just a tad bit darker than we had on the Clairfontaine. It does feather a lot. It does spread a lot. It does not shade at all. Again, it's copy paper. Looking at the page underneath, you can see that it bled somewhere in this region here. Pretty much the whole thing. Seeing the back of the page, there's no question why, with the ink really going all the way through, it's not ghosting so much as writing on both sides.
So what nib and pen do I think is going to give the best writing experience with this ink?
I prefer the lighter green from a regular to dry medium. Now, the slightly thicker line looks nice compared to the fine in this case. Really does help show some of that color. Just remember, there's no such thing as shading with this ink, but there's a lot of permanence, which is why you would really want to be using it.
I hope you got something out of this video, and if you want to be able to follow me over on Instagram, I'm there as an ink guy. Thanks for watching.